I love James Bond. Who doesn't? Heh, good point. But most people love James Bond. It's a film franchise marvel, having had 24 official movies made, and the 25th movie is well on the way as of the creation of this video. There have been at least 3 unofficial movies as well, but given their lack of affiliation with Eon, many do not consider them a part of the official franchise. And as a huge fan of James Bond, I think the best testament to the franchise is to watch every movie and construct a ranking list of the movies, from my least favourite to my favourite. Now, it's important to note that this is far from being an objective list, so films you might like or think are objectively good films may be low on my personal ranking, and vice versa. But honestly, I think that adds to the fandom's diversity. It's very unlikely that any 2 people are going to have exactly the same ranking of the films for exactly the same reasons, and that diversity of thought is what allows us to share and educate our own opinions. And as I hinted at, I'm not going to be ranking the 3 unofficial movies that I'm aware of, being the 1954 Casino Royale made-for-television movie, the 1967 comedy Casino Royale, and the 1983 standalone starring former James Bond star Sean Connery, Never Say Never Again, although I don't view either of these particularly highly as films. The 1954 film is serviceable, I suppose, for the time period. So without any further ado, let's get started. The most recent Bond film to be released, Spectre, is also my least favourite in the franchise. I really do struggle to name good things about this film because it's just so perpetually bad. Craig's fine, I suppose, even though I've grown to find him one of the weakest Bonds alongside Lazenby. I enjoy Mr. Hinx because it's Dave Bautista and I'm a big WWE fan, and there's very slight touches of classic Bond charm in the movie at points, but it's not enough to save it from the beyond insulting plot and villain. I know Christoph Waltz can act extremely well, but in this movie he gives us perhaps the worst villain performance I've ever seen in a AAA movie, and degrades the Blofeld character more than actually adding to it in the grand scheme of the franchise. In his defence though, the plot is so bad that it makes DeviantArt creepypastas look like Shakespeare in comparison, and it turns in such a way as to kick the entire franchise in the balls repeatedly whenever it can. The movie even finds a way to cock up the few beneficial assets it has going for it, such as tragic misdirection of actors and a criminal misuse of Mr. Hinx in what should have been the most influential henchman since Xenia or Jaws. I can't stress how bad the plot is and how terrible the writing is. They didn't just butcher Blofeld, but they managed to butcher a good villain from the last movie by needlessly attaching him to Spectre, and turned Bond into a quarter-baked drama at best. Madeleine is a terribly boring Bond girl and easily among the worst in the franchise. The action is uninspired. Max Denby is a pointless addition just to add another big name to the cast, and the MI6 regulars are overused in a terribly dull climax. It really does seem that after the success of Skyfall, the producers, or whoever was responsible, got complacent and shat out this convoluted mess of a film. And the worst crime a Bond film can commit is to seem as if there was very little actual thought, care and effort put into it. If you like this movie, great, but for me, there's almost nothing to like about this movie. At least it qualifies as a movie, unlike the monstrosity that is Casino Royale 67. This is probably the entry that I'm going to get in the most trouble for. Every Bond fan has that one movie that most people love but they personally hate. For some it's Thunderball, for some others it's Skyfall, but for me that movie is The Living Daylights. There is some good stuff in this film, like Dalton's performance as Bond, the henchman Necros is badass, the soundtrack is one of John Barry's finest, and while mysteriously disappearing about halfway through the movie and only reappearing at the end, I enjoy John Rhys-Davies' performance as General Pushkit. But other than this, I feel this movie is plagued by problems that cripple any potential enjoyment I can get out of it. Kara as a Bond girl fulfills the unholy trifecta of being boring, annoying and stupid. The villains are weak, with Koskov coming across more like a bad twist Disney villain, and Whittaker being miscast and miswritten, especially considering Joe Don Baker was cast far better just 2 films later. None of the action really stands out, with even Necros' death just being a rehash of Gobinda's death 2 films prior, and the plot is needlessly complex and hard to follow for a Bond film, whilst lacking the ability to engage the viewer enough to care. But for me, the thing that really damages the film in my eyes is the fact that the Cold War jingoism reaches a point in The Living Daylights that we end up having Bond work with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. I know the filmmakers couldn't have foreseen the events of 9/11 and further consequences of the glorification of the Mujahideen during the Cold War, but it just profoundly disturbs me in how horribly misguided it is. Even the Connery movies knew to treat the Russians with some respect, and showing these supposed Bond allies celebrating over the corpses of soldiers just doing their job is, well, as I said, disturbing. I know secret agencies often have to make unsavory contacts and do unsavory things, and I'd be a bit more permissive of it if it was trying to represent that, but I don't think that was the filmmaker's intent. As it stands, The Living Daylights is my second least favourite movie in the franchise, and unless I can see this film in the same light as other people do, I don't see this movie rising much in my rankings.
When you were young and your heart was an open book.
You know, I want to like this film better, as I do most of Roger Moore's films, as I find he's the best thing in them, but Live and Let Die is just so boring to me. As I said, Moore is great, and the performances are all fine, especially from the villains played by Yaphet Kotto, Julius Harris, and Geoffrey Holder, respectively, and I'm still impressed by the stunt work in this film, particularly the alligator farm scene, but other than that, this movie is not all that engaging. I think the big issue with Live and Let Die for me is the plot and how low scale and weak it is. The character of Dr. Kananga I find to be a weak one, and a good performance can only go so far in fleshing out this adversary. Usually the best Bond villains fall into one of two categories, either megalomaniacs who have a grand plan to change the world as we know it like Goldfinger or Blofeld, or villains with a more personal relationship with Bond such as Scaramanga or Sanchez. Kananga on the other hand doesn't really fit either. He's not a very fleshed out character, and his plan is definitely among the more low scale schemes. It's not as if Bond is really against the clock here. Also, I really dislike how much, well, there's no better way to put it, magic plays a role in the story. I can abide sci-fi elements in Bond films, even the batshit insane like the concept behind Renard in The World Is Not Enough, but magic really is taking it one step too far beyond believability for me. And the elephant in the room, Sheriff J.W. Pepper. Yeah. Look, I dislike this character, but it's not so much him that annoys me, it's the fact that the movie suddenly becomes the Sheriff J.W. Pepper show, instead of actually focusing on Bond during the boat chase. It's as if the writers thought they were writing comedic gold, but it just comes across as painfully forced at the best of times. Why did this character need so much screen time and focus? I want to focus on Bond, not this unfunny character. I understand that this movie has a lot of hardline fans, and I do want to enjoy this one more than I already do, but as it stands, Live and Let Die is my third least favourite movie in the franchise. But at least it has my all-time best Bond song. I call this one Quantum of Camera Cuts because the editing in this movie is quite frankly the absolute worst I have ever seen in a serious movie. The camera can't hold a shot for more than 2 seconds, and I doubt I could follow the action on excessive Ritalin. Not that I'd really want to, as the cuts really add nothing to the action itself. With that said, I feel Quantum is a movie with missed potential. Some of the action, if you can see it, is creative. I think Camille is a decent Bond girl, Giancarlo Giannini is brilliant once again as Mathis, and I like the idea behind Dominic Green being a manipulative villain. I just don't think the execution was quite right. But the movie continues to dwell on Vesper when it really should have moved on and told its own narrative instead of being anchored onto a finished story. As Bond said at the end of Casino Royale, the bitch is dead. The rest of the storyline isn't any better, with a misuse of both the M and Felix Leiter characters, and a main plan that feels half-baked and not all that compelling. No offense to any Bolivians watching, but does anyone really care all that much about Bolivia anyway? If you really wanted a South American country in danger, try Brazil or Argentina, or somewhere where the stakes are higher. Overall, I can see what Quantum tried to do, and I have a small amount of respect for it. I just think there could have been a lot more effort and thought in reaching the destination that is supposedly aimed for. If the rest of the movie was as bad as the first half, then it would be worse than Spectre in my book. Thankfully, Octopussy does get better as the movie goes on, although not to a tremendous degree. The saddest thing about Roger Moore's tenure as Bond is that despite starring in a record number of official movies in the franchise, and ranging from good to outstanding in all of them, I felt he never got the perfect alignment of separate elements like great Bond villain, great Bond girl, great henchman, etc. in a single movie together, instead being spread out across several. Maud Adams is great as Octopussy. It's good to see Desmond Llewellyn have more of an involved role in the story. I enjoy some of the action sequences like the pre-title sequence and the fight on the train, and Steven Berkoff, even if he really is overacting, is enjoyable to watch. But the plot is far-fetched and incredibly boring during the first half. Louis Jourdan really tries his all to add something to the Kamal Khan character, but it's a terribly dull and poorly written main villain, and the comedy is at an all-time low in this movie, with the tennis sequence and the horrific safari scene standing out for me. The first half for me is almost unwatchable, but after the safari scene the movie does get better, and while there's still some stupid moments, I feel the movie redeems itself. If it could have just had a stronger first half, Octopussy would have fared much better. This is a movie I used to abhor, but now I've somewhat come to peace with it. Yes, Die Another Day is 19th, and I was surprised as you are to see it as high as it is on my list. I can't say it's a good movie by any means, but I think there's enough good stuff in it, as well as the bad stuff not being quite as insulting as I remember. Well, apart from the horrendous love dialogue that makes the Star Wars prequel sound heartwarming. Brosnan is my personal favourite Bond, but I have mixed feelings on his performance in this movie. On the one hand, it's not a bad performance, but on the other, it's not adequately tailored to the movie he's in. There should have been an opportunity for him to cut loose just a little bit. Halle Berry is meh, but I put the blame on poor direction rather than poor acting here. There's a lot of start-stop editing that just comes across as annoying at the best of times, and a lot of head-scratching and plain stupid moments like Bond stopping his own heart and the CGI abomination that is the windsurfing sequence. With that said, I've grown to somewhat like Toby Stephens as Gustav Graves. He's far from being the best villain, but I think he has a great introduction, and the whole philanthropist who never sleeps gimmick is something that honestly intrigues me. Although the fact nobody bothered to do basic fact confirmation in-universe on his early life is baffling to me. The action in this movie is also for the most part pretty good, with the car chase between Bond and Zile standing out in particular, and the supporting cast are all good, particularly Rosamund Pike as Miranda Frost, who I think is hands down the best femme fatale in a Bond movie. Die Another Day has a lot of problems, absolutely, but I think there's enough in this movie for me to enjoy. I think it's a movie I can just kick back and turn my brain off for and have some fun despite the glaring issues it has. Much like Die Another Day, Diamonds Are Forever is a movie that I definitely understand the disdain it gets in the fandom, but I think there's enough decent stuff in the movie for it to stand as an okay entry in the franchise. The main critique I have with Diamonds is Connery's performance. I've seen Connery get lambasted for his performance in You Only Live Twice, but I think this one is far worse. He's so disinterested and not engaging. The only good thing that came out of his performance is the charitable donations he made with his hefty salary. I also think the action in this movie is weak, save for an excellent fight in the elevator in the first half of the movie, but the rest of the action is kind of been there, done that. The plot also is needlessly convoluted, with plenty of unnecessary characters, side plots that go nowhere, and at times it's hard to follow. On the other hand, Jill St. John is okay as a more humorous take on a Bond girl, Charles Gray is entertaining as Blofeld and doesn't get enough credit, despite getting a little too ridiculous at times, Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd are fun henchmen, and Las Vegas is a nice looking location for a Bond film. Overall, I think Diamonds is probably the movie I had the least strong feelings about, one way or another. I just think it's a passable film in the series, with enough standing out to not make it a complete bore. Remember when I said my ranking of The Living Daylights might get me into trouble? Well, this one could be even worse depending on your opinion. Yeah, On Her Majesty's Secret Service is only 17th. Now let me be clear, I do think this is a decent movie overall, but I think the big issue I have with this movie is that it suffers from overhype from a portion of the fandom, very much similar to what I'd call the Sega Dreamcast effect. What I mean is that when you have so many people going around saying, guys, this is so underrated, check it out, to the point where it no longer becomes underrated at all, it actually becomes overrated in an ironic, self-fulfilling prophetic sense, whereas actual underrated movies in the series fly under the radar still. This really does skewer my perception of the film, because while there's good stuff in it, I just don't see it at all as a great movie. I've come to some peace with Lazenby as Bond, and he seems like a nice guy in interviews and public events, but he's not engaging and he's not Bond. I've seen people make arguments that Connery would be out of place in this specific film in the series, and whilst I see the points, that doesn't mean that Lazenby's performance is better by default. My thoughts on Telly Savalas as Blofeld are somewhat similar to my feelings on Brosnan in Die Another Day. It's a good performance, but I don't know if it's the right one for the character. Although in this instance, I don't think Savalas deserves any blame, but rather the scripting. I mean, why is the head of a terrorist organisation who is supposed to be hiding in a mountain base skiing after his enemy and putting himself in harm's way? I know his portrayal is supposed to be closer to the literary Blofeld, but I think it undermines the Blofeld we already know in the movies even more than having him in drag in Diamonds Are Forever, because I can at least excuse that as desperation, a characteristic I see more in Blofeld than putting himself in danger needlessly. Another big issue I have with this movie is just how boring it is at times, particularly in how long it sticks in Switzerland. From when Bond goes in disguise to enter Blofeld's base to when he finally gets captured is beyond tedious, and Lazenby is not interesting enough as Bond to make it worth it. A Bond like Moore could have made this dead time a lot more engaging, but Lazenby really can't. The action in this movie is also lacking, with exception being made for a brilliant climax as Bond storms the lair. In terms of positives, Diana Rigg is brilliant as Tracy, Irma Bunt is a cool henchwoman who I think could have done with a bit more screen time, Gabriel Fazzetti as Draco is one of the best Bond male allies, the final battle scene, as I said, is brilliant, and while I don't think it's quite as amazing as some fans make it out to be, I do like the ending to this movie, as it serves as an ominous cliffhanger of sorts for the next movie in the franchise. I do like Majesties, but I think the best word to sum up my feelings towards it is overrated. Maybe I'll grow to like it more in the future. Hell, I used to dislike this movie a lot more, but I still think it's a movie worth watching in the franchise with some fantastic parts in it, just not enough for it to be any higher in my list. When I think of For Your Eyes Only, I think of so much missed potential. That doesn't mean the end result is bad, but what they could have done with this movie. Moore's strong as always in this movie. Locke is a surprisingly underrated henchman, Columbo is a cool character, and despite the character having very little meat to it, Julian Glover is solid as Aristotle Christatos. I also really like the tension this movie can build, even if the execution isn't always the best, and whilst I don't think it was as good as it should have been, I appreciate that For Your Eyes Only wanted a more down-to-earth gritty tone with twists and turns that aren't as needlessly complex as, say, The Living Daylights. As for my criticisms of the film, I think my main one really does come down to the execution. This movie could have been so much more, but it's hindered by the relatively low stakes, the stupidity of the villains at moments, and honestly bad editing and camera work in my personal view, especially during the action sequences. BB is also a pointless character that didn't even need to be in the movie, and that time could have been used to better develop other characters that needed it, like Christatos, Luigi, or the main Bond girl, Melina, who's okay, but not all that interesting outside of her revenge story arc, which seemed a little half-baked. I think For Your Eyes Only could have been an amazing Bond film, but as is, it's decent. I just really think that it could have been so much more than just decent though, which makes me have a sense of pity for this movie. It's good, but far from the greatness it should have been. Out of all the Bond films, this one I feel is the most inconsistent. The Man with the Golden Gun has some things that are phenomenal, and then some things which just really suck. And I do mean literally suck, but we'll get to the nauseating moment shortly. I think it's an objective truth that Christopher Lee is brilliant as always in this movie, and his character Francisco Scaramanga, the titular man, is pretty awesome too. Hervé Villechaize as Knick-Knack is a henchman with a lot of character and personality as well, and as a villainous duo they're a delight to watch. I also really like Roger Moore's performance in this movie, strangely enough. I know a lot of people have criticised his performance as trying to ape Connery, but I really do think Moore holds his own with Christopher Lee in the scenes that they share, which is no small task, and I enjoy how they make this movie and the series seem a little more personal. Maud Adams is good, although her best role in the series was to come in Octopussy, and I think Lieutenant Hip is a cool Bond male ally. But the action is very much lacking in this movie. Hell, Bond only has one actual kill in it. And even amazing stunts like the car loop are somewhat saturated by poor post-production choices. Sheriff Pepper returns from Live and Let Die, and whilst he's not as bad in this movie, he certainly did not need to come back. High Fat is an awful secondary villain responsible for one of the stupidest setups in Bond with the martial arts score, and having Bond suck the navel of a belly dancer to end up swallowing a golden bullet is just plain disgusting. Overall, it's a very mixed bag, but I do think the good outweighs the bad in this particular movie, and it's definitely worth watching for the high highs that it does manage to reach. I think this is the point in the list where the movies start becoming legitimately good movies for me, personally. With that said, I think this next movie is really going to piss some of you off for being so high, especially considering that it's 3 spots above Majesty's. Yep, I enjoy A View to a Kill a fair bit, and I think what makes this film so high on the list is my perspective on it more than anything else. I see it as very much a celebration of the Roger Moore era, a final over-the-top goodbye to Roger's tenure as Bond, which, from what I've heard, wasn't the filmmakers' intentions, as they wanted to keep using Moore until he retired from the role. But I think because this was Moore's last film and they went so balls to the wall, I'm a lot more forgiving of the strange and bizarre things in this movie. Do I even need to say that Christopher Walken and Grace Jones are great as main villain and henchlady respectively? Even people who hate this film enjoy these two. And you know what, controversial opinion, but I kind of like Stacey Sutton. Sure, her screaming can be irritating, but tell me, if you were in an elevator on fire with your only possibility of escape seemingly deserting you, wouldn't you be screaming in fear also? I actually enjoyed the plot also. Some have called it a Goldfinger knockoff, and yeah, it's similar in structure, but the variables I feel are changed up enough for it to be engaging. Moore is good as always in this film, but is sadly just too old at this point to be believable in the role. The action in this film also seems to be on the weaker side as well in comparison to other films in the series, and the first half of this film is pretty much pointless with the whole horse racing subplot really going nowhere, although the film definitely picks up once we reach California. I think this film serves as a time capsule more than anything, which ironically enough makes it stand the test of time for me personally. I think it's because I see it more as a stepping stone in the franchise to end the Roger Moore era, rather than just a standalone movie, that I'm as positive as I am about the movie. But you know what? I have no regrets in admitting that I like this movie. Whilst I do like this movie, I think the strongest feeling I have for Dr. No is more of a respectful admiration than any kind of deep love for it. It is the first Bond movie in the series, and as a result of that, I acknowledge that in many aspects the funding and technology was not up to the same standard as the other films in the series. And for what they had, they created a solid movie and a strong start to the series. Connery has a really good outing in this movie, and it's probably my second favourite performance of his in the series. Ursula Andress as Honey Rider is gorgeous beyond measure, and really set a high bar for other Bond girls to match. Dr. No is a decent villain played well by Joseph Wiseman, although I don't really like how the movie handles his character, giving him only 3 scenes, and that's being extremely generous. The supporting cast is all great and really add to the atmosphere of the movie, and I admire the effects they used in this movie, especially that big explosion at the end. The action's nothing special otherwise, but to be expected given that this is the first official outing. I've heard people rag on Dr. No somewhat, calling it generic and vanilla, but I think there's enough here for it to stand on its own as a unique adventure in the franchise, and as a sturdy bedrock for the series going forward. There's nothing in this movie I'd consider terrible. It's a consistently strong film from start to finish, which is why it's comfortably in the middle of my rankings. I might be decapitated for putting this one so low. Look, I like Casino Royale, alright? If I didn't, it wouldn't be this high on the list, and as I said, we are at the point where I start to really enjoy these movies now. But this movie, for all its strengths, has a few weaknesses that really prevent it from being an all-time great in my eyes. As I mentioned, I'm not a huge fan of Daniel Craig as Bond. I think he plays the role a little too rough and jagged. There's a lack of sophistication which really shows when he has to deliver the dialogue, though I'll talk about that shortly. I think Dalton is a good example of a Bond who can do both tough and sophisticated well, whereas I feel Craig is just trying to imitate Connery and he can't muster it. Eva Green has a great performance as Vesper, but I've got to be honest, I think this character is overrated. There's good intentions in what the movie wants us to feel about Vesper and Bond's relationship, but it just doesn't feel earned, with the character progression between the two not really feeling natural. It's not that I dislike this character, but the movie puts so much effort into developing her, and I don't think it pays off. The dialogue in this movie is plain awful in my opinion, with the banter between Bond and Vesper whilst they travel to the casino being the worst of it. It sounds like the kind of pseudo-intellectual nonsense I'd write when I was 15 to try and sound smart on an exam so I could get extra marks, instead of natural conversation. With the negatives listed, I think Le Chiffre is an interesting villain. I love Giancarlo Giannini as Mathis, the poker scenes are well shot and genuinely enjoyable and tense, and the action in this movie is phenomenal, with the highlight being the fight at the airport, which is one of the best action sequences in the entire franchise easily. All in all, I think Casino Royale is a good movie, but not a great movie, as key components hold it back from really being the masterpiece many fans see it as, for my money. Just missing out on the top 10 is Moonraker. Yeah, fight me, I like this movie more than Casino Royale. This is probably the most batshit insane of all the movies in the series, and for that reason a lot of people hate this movie. While there are moments that do go a little too over the top for me, I don't think the movie ever completely loses me, and I think it adds to the charm of the specific entry in the franchise. You know the drill about more now, and I've really grown to like Michael Lonsdale as Hugo Drax. I used to find him a bit boring, but I just enjoy his snobbery and collected demeanour, which really makes the moment where he snaps at Jaws all the more interesting. Of course Jaws is great, and I don't mind the whole girlfriend subplot, as it does add a little bit more depth to the character without compromising his badassery. And I've got to give a shout out to Chang, Drax's first henchman before Jaws, as that guy doesn't get enough credit as being an awesome henchman, even if his time in the movie is quite short. But there are weak points to this movie, namely Lois Chiles as Holly Goodhead, who is perhaps my least favourite Bond girl in the franchise. Aside from being a second-rate clone of Anya from the previous film, her performance is just so bad and wooden. At least Drax was a better version of Stromberg. If you're going to copy a character from the last movie, at least do it better. The Venice section of this movie is pretty infamous, with the gondola on land and the double-taking pigeon being classic examples, but one thing that never gets brought up, which bugs the ever-loving hell out of me, is why the hell aren't those idiot scientists wearing hazmat suits or any kind of protection whilst working with such a toxic chemical? And on that note, how did Drax somehow get rid of that chemical when Bond and M enter the room later on in the film? Isn't this chemical supposed to wipe out all of humanity? How could it just be brushed away just like that? I'm not one to get pedantic over plot holes, but these two really annoy me. Anyhow, Moonraker is fun. It knows what it is and just has fun with it, and I applaud it for that. It's a movie that I can easily rewatch, flip my brain off for, and enjoy it every single time. I used to really dislike The World Is Not Enough, but over time I've grown to consider it an underrated gem in the Bond catalogue, and it's probably the movie my opinion has changed the most on. I think my change in opinion mainly centres on being more forgiving of some of the flaws in this movie, as well as really getting into the dynamic between Bond and Elektra King the movie builds. I think this movie has Brosnan's best performance as Bond, allowing him to portray a wide range of emotions. He is just perfect in the role here. Sophie Marceau is outstanding as Elektra King, and I've grown to some peace with Robert Carlyle as Renard, though I still think the gimmick is poorly executed and not played around with enough to really justify its existence. The action sequences, particularly the pre-title sequence, are phenomenal. Desmond Llewellyn gets a perfect send-off as Q, and I think Robbie Coltrane as Zukovsky is used better in this film than in Goldeneye. I also kind of like Denise Richards as Christmas Jones in a weird way. She's a more comedic Bond girl in a similar vein to Tiffany Case or Mary Goodnight, but I'd be lying if I said her acting was great. The CGI in this movie is pretty atrocious at points, with Bond jumping out of the window into the ocean, making the effects from Die Another Day look serviceable in comparison. The film also has a few too many characters that don't get expanded upon much at all, like Bullion, Davidoff, R and Elektra's bodyguard, just to name a few, which really does add up. And while I do like the more personal dynamic in this movie, I acknowledge that this might not be everyone's cup of tea. I do think The World Is Not Enough is a film that needs more attention. There are flaws, but there's more than enough good stuff for it to really stand on its own 2 feet as a really solid entry in the franchise. I know this movie has problems, but I can't help but really enjoy Thunderball. This is one of the movies that really captures the atmosphere of 60s Bond and just has fun with telling a grand, epic story, even if it means mistakes cropping up here and there. Connery is solid in this movie, Domino is an okay Bond girl, and you know what, I like Emilio Largo, and he's exactly who I'd expect to be the second in command of Spectre. A man who, despite his age, gets things done and even participates physically in Spectre's own schemes. You have to admire the man's dedication to the mission, and he even gives Bond a run for his money in the climax. I see him as a dragon that Bond needs to slay more than anything else, somewhat similar to Ivan Drago from Rocky IV. He's not an intelligent schemer, but he doesn't really need to be. He's a different kind of villain for Bond to face, which I respect. The movie is also gorgeous, and to this day remains a visual marvel, especially those underwater scenes, which must have been a huge technical feat at the time, and I enjoy the scale of the action scenes, even if underwater they can be very slow and laborious. Thunderball, as I said though, does have problems. Much like The World Is Not Enough, there's too many characters in this movie that are just underdeveloped, and it does collapse on its own weight somewhat. There's a lot of missed touches that really could have made this film a lot stronger. Still, as a complete package, I think the movie is enjoyable, and whilst it does drag at parts, the great scenes make it more than worth it in the end. Remember how I said with A View to a Kill that the movies from then on were movies I considered good? Well, we've reached a point on the list where good turns to great. You Only Live Twice is a great film from start to end, in fact. Everybody loves the volcano lair sequence, and it is the highlight of the film, but I really think the first 2/3 of the film are strong also, and act as a strong build-up to the final confrontation, as well as some great action scenes in the factory and with Little Nelly, a technical feat that still impresses me to this day. Connery receives a lot of criticism for his performance in this movie, and while it's far from his best performance, I think he's fine here. Worst performances were to come in his last 2 movies in the role. Tanaka and Aki are awesome sidekicks, and Donald Pleasance is the definitive Blofeld to this very day for me. Japan is also a gorgeous location for a Bond film, and allows for a variety of different locales and scenes to take place. One minor complaint I have with the film is the character of Kissy, and why she even needed to be a character written into the film in the first place. Aki didn't need to be killed off, she could have stayed and been one of the all-time best Bond girls if her role was combined with Kissy's, and we wouldn't have had as much behind-the-scenes drama. But yeah, I really enjoy You Only Live Twice, and I see it as the last Bond movie of an era, and a good one to end Connery's first tenure as Bond. This film used to be at the very top of my rankings at number 1, but has since slipped down a fair degree now that I've identified some of the problems with the movie, and perhaps over-accentuated the positives. Nonetheless, I still think Skyfall is a great movie and Craig's best film to date, with his best performance in the film also. The action in this movie is unbelievable. Judi Dench gets as good a send-off as you can get for being such an important character in the franchise. I like Ben Whishaw and Naomi Harris as Q and Moneypenny respectively, as well as Ray Fiennes as the new M. Raul Silva is a fun villain, although perhaps a little cliché for the time period Skyfall was released in, and I do like how this movie stands on its own from the other 2 Craig films released at that point, although the next film in the franchise does its best to sabotage that, and Skyfall ultimately does take some risks that I think pay off. There are some issues with the film though, with the plot being a little too conveniently manufactured at points, Séverine being a completely pointless character and existing just for Bond to bang her, and the sudden introduction to a concept about Bond being an old weary veteran when only 2 films ago he was supposed to have earned his 00 status. There are some people who really abhor this film and see it as a spit in the face of classic Bond, but I respectfully disagree. The Craig films were always their own thing, and while I've not really thought of them particularly highly in the wider context of the series, I think Skyfall stands as the best of the bunch, and I think the hatred this film gets from this portion of the fandom is just a little too pronounced. I mean, Spectre exists and is deserving of far more hatred than an enjoyable action movie, and by far the best of the modern era of Bond in my opinion. just missing out on the top 5 is From Russia with Love. It really does hurt for this movie to miss out because I do love it. It's just I happen to love the other 5 movies in the series more. I think this is the closest the James Bond movies get to Hitchcockian, and I'm not just talking about that scene they borrowed/stole from North by Northwest. I mean in terms of pacing, cinematography and directing. I think Terence Young's Bond movies stand stronger when not viewed chronologically, as they incorporate a similar style of pacing and approach to Bond. And I think it works best in From Russia with Love because of the intrigue and suspense that the plot creates. Connery's performance I don't think is quite as good as his performance in Dr. No and Goldfinger, but I still think it's a solid outing. Tatiana is an alright Bond girl, just serviceable for the movie she's in. Red Grant is a legendary henchman. Rosa Klebb is a decent, if somewhat underutilised villainess. Karen Bay is an entertaining Bond male ally. And the action in this film, especially for the time frame, is a huge step up from Dr. No. That train fight is an impressive technical feat to this day, and I really like the gypsy camp fight and the subsequent sniper scene also. I don't think this movie is perfect, however, as I'd have liked to seen the female characters and Kronstein perhaps having a little more expansion given the slower pace this movie takes. And speaking of the pace, I think having to wait until the final 20 minutes of the film for Bond to finally fall into Spector's plan is a bit too much of a wait. We know eventually Red Grant and Bond are going to have a showdown, and it is awesome, but I feel the period between the wait is a little slow, and could have done with showing Bond in a little more danger, which I think is a problem overall with Connery's portrayal of the character. He usually seems a little too perfect at times, and that makes the success in his missions feel less like a triumph and more of a foregone conclusion. Those gripes are only minor though, because From Russia with Love is a fantastic movie, and I can easily see why this movie is thought of so highly within the Bond franchise. As I said earlier in this list, it's always saddened me that Roger Moore never got every element of his films perfectly lined up to create a masterpiece, but I think The Spy Who Loved Me definitely comes the closest to doing so, and is my favourite Moore movie. This is my personal favourite performance from Moore himself. He's a perfect blend of charming and badass in this adventure, and accompanying him is an equally badass Bond girl in Anya. I've seen some critics call Barbara Bach wooden, but I think the whole point of her character is to have her as a cold-hearted and efficient USSR agent who gradually warms up to Bond. I know the movie makes use of the misunderstanding cliché, which is usually painful to sit through in romantic comedies, but I think in this movie it works, given the clear danger and threat that Anya could legitimately pose to Bond. Jaws is probably the most recognisable henchman in the series, and for bloody good reason. He's the perfect blend of menacing and entertaining, and the action scenes involving him are all great, as are pretty much all of the action scenes in this movie. They're so large scale and well thought out. I also think this movie probably has the best humour in all of Bond. That moment where Bond puts the out of order sign on Max Kalber's corpse still makes me laugh every time. The only major gripe I have with this movie is the main villain, Stromberg. I think he has a decent introduction in blowing up the helicopter, but after that the character has absolutely nothing to work with. We never find out his motivation as to why he wants to commit his dastardly plan, other than he's just a generic rich douchebag, and there's zero colour to the performance either, which makes him completely unmemorable, which is a shame, as in other stuff I've seen him in, I think Kurt Jürgens is a good actor. What I think doesn't help is the accent. As Cassie Cage from Mortal Kombat would say, there are scarier nationalities than Swedish, and it makes it hard to take him seriously, which, given how this character is meant to be a threatening villain, deeply undermines him. But at least he's better than Waltz's Blofeld, or Whittaker for that matter. But given how much weighting I give to the villains in Bond movies, I think the fact that The Spy Who Loved Me is as great as it is despite having one of the weakest main villains in the franchise really is a testament to how superb the other elements are. With a great main villain, I could even see this movie topping my list, but as is, it's a comfortable number 5 on my list. For the Dalton fans who stuck around after I lambasted The Living Daylights, here's your reward. I love Licence to Kill, and I think it's borderline criminal that it did as badly as it did at the box office. This is a much more confident and well thought out movie than Dalton's first outing, and it's definitely a high note for Dalton to finish his relatively short tenure on. Speaking of Dalton, he's just phenomenal here. I praised his performance as one of the few things I liked about The Living Daylights, but this is just in another league. He's given so much more to work with and gets to run with all kinds of emotions and drama, and he just nails it here. Pam is also a good Bond girl. I wouldn't call her top tier, but she's definitely one of the better ones in the series. Whilst Talisa Soto's performance is a little wooden, I think her character adds an interesting dynamic, and she's not just there to die and further the plot like in other Bond movies with a secondary female. But for me, the standout performance and character in this movie is Robert Davi as Franz Sanchez. He is just perfect, and my favourite Bond villain in the entire franchise, which given the amount of great villains in the series, is extremely high praise. As much as I love characters like Goldfinger or Zorin, Sanchez is the only villain thus far that feels like a fully three-dimensional character, in that he's developed throughout the movie and actually somewhat complex. He's not a complete monster, he rewards loyalty to his operations, he can actually be quite charming and charismatic in public and in business meetings, and he even has a good sense of humour, but the fact that beneath all that hides a ruthless, angry man makes a great character, and it's the cause of stupendous writing and a stupendous performance. The only real fault I have in this movie is the direction in non-action scenes. The direction for action is outstanding, and the tanker chase scene at the end might just be my favourite action sequence in all of Bond, but I think some of the performances are a little awkward. Benicio del Toro as Dario is a good henchman, but I feel at points that direction makes him come across as a bit awkward, and I think Talisa Soto suffers a similar fate, as do a lot of the supporting cast. But it's far from being awful, and the main cast is more than good enough to make this only a minor gripe at best. This movie is proof that Bond going dark can be done remarkably well, and as I said, it's a crying shame that this movie didn't perform better than it did at the box office. GoldenEye, now we're talking. This film has really risen up as a colossal fan favourite over the years, and deservedly so. It's just an all-around brilliant movie. Brosnan is brilliant in his very first outing, the Bond girl is brilliant, the Bond villain is great, the henchwoman is amazing, the supporting villains are great, the MI6 regulars are fantastic, the supporting characters are decent, the action is great, the story is good. There's just so much of this movie to praise. But I do have a couple of minor criticisms with it that just about prevent it from being second or first on my list. I think the first is that I don't think the character of Valentin Zukovsky is very well utilised. We're supposed to buy that he's a shady and dangerous character, but he's played more as comic relief, and he only really exists as a means to get Bond from the start of his mission to meeting Alec. I think Zukovsky was better utilised in The World Is Not Enough. The other, again mild criticism I have is that the scenes on Cuba used to develop Natalia and Bond's relationship feel a little tacked on and clumsy, and more out of a necessity to make us connect with Natalia further than we already are. I really don't think these scenes add much to the movie and could have been cut, and maybe replaced with a couple of deleted scenes in their stead, like when Oromov and Boris interact with one another. But the fact that these are the only gripes I have with the movie should really tell you how much I adore this movie. I'm so glad that it's being recognised not just for the groundbreaking game under the same name, but as a fantastic movie on its own merits. And given that the series was on shaky ground after the financial failure of License to Kill, this was the movie that kicked the franchise back to life. I think 98% of fans will have this movie in their top 5, and understandably so. It's Bond at his most iconic, and objectively speaking, at his very best. Goldfinger is a cinematic marvel, and often on greatest films of all time lists, and deservedly so. Virtually everything in this film is at least good, and many things are downright outstanding. Connery is probably my fourth favourite Bond, and I do take issue with the screenwriting and directing concerning the Bond character in his particular films, but here he is just perfect. He is James Bond, placed in a perfect sense of danger, which makes it all the more triumphant when he overcomes it. I have heard complaints about this film in the series and how it portrays Bond as weak and not all that essential to the plot, which I think is a ridiculous charge. Bond does plenty in this film, and Connery gets to show a wider range and what he's really capable of whilst retaining his badassery. Speaking of badassery, Gert Frobe as Goldfinger is just a classic brilliant Bond villain. He's smart, he's resourceful, he's even somewhat charming at times, but most of all he is a magnificent bastard, with a timeless and honestly ingenious plan, and accompanied by Oddjob, one of the most iconic henchmen in the series, and one of the most threatening also. The action once again is a step up from the previous film, much like how From Russia with Love improved upon Dr. No, and we get so many brilliant moments like the introduction of the classic Desmond Llewellyn Q formula, the Aston Martin DB5 in action for the first time, the Fort Knox raid, the opening sequence, it's all just great. Again, my complaints are only minor, but I do feel Pussy Galore is a little overrated in the wider context of the series. She's by zero means bad, she's just a little dull, and I think a switch to the side of good is far too sudden. She mainly stands out because of her name and the fact that she was played by Honor Blackman. There's also a couple of scenes that maybe play out a little too long, in particular the death of Mr. Solo at the hands of Odd Job, but other than that, Goldfinger is the quintessential Bond movie. The reputation it has garnered is more than appropriate, and quite honestly is the Bond film I'd recommend the most to introducing people to the franchise. There's just one movie in the franchise that ticks my personal boxes more. And that movie is Tomorrow Never Dies. I know what you're thinking. Really? The second Pierce Brosnan movie? Of all the movies in the franchise, that one's my favourite? Well, yeah, it is. Now, if I was being strictly objective, this probably wouldn't be the case. Although quite honestly, I'd still rank it in the top 5, because it really is well made and criminally underrated, as it is in the wider context of the series. So, why is Tomorrow Never Dies, of all the Bond films, my favourite movie of the 24? Well, a few reasons. Firstly, this movie is not only capable of pulling off the classic Bond formula pretty much flawlessly, but it also adds an entire new dimension to it by making it smarter and offering the viewer an element of social commentary in its plot, which is concerning the media's influence on minds and opinions, as well as the impact of propaganda. Wherever you fall on the political compass, it's pretty much universally agreed upon that oftentimes, particularly in politics, the media will distort, glorify, or even downright fabricate in order to accomplish its bottom line, whether it be for profit, to push a specific ideology, or both. There is a legitimate discussion to be had about disinformation and fake news in our climate, and while other movies such as They Live and Nightcrawler cover the impact of the media a little better, it's still amazing that of all film franchises, James Bond covered this, and covered it brilliantly in its own unique way, mixing thought-provoking commentary whilst not compromising the fact that it's a Bond movie. It's a lot like Demolition Man in that the commentary in this movie is even more applicable today than it ever was in the past, because we live in the age of the internet. Brosnan has settled in perfectly as Bond in this movie, confident and able to run the gambit of being suave like Connery, charming like Moore, and tough like Dalton, synergising these takes into what I feel is the best James Bond. Wai Lin is an awesome Bond girl who doesn't just feel like a token female character for Bond to get with in the end. They actually have her be a legitimate Bond equal, and in many respects even surpass Bond, which I really respect and makes the connection between these characters stronger. She's a great female lead, played pretty much spot on by Michelle Yeoh. But my favourite performance in this movie has to be Jonathan Pryce as the main villain, Elliot Carver, the media tycoon, and he just has a ball with it. He goes full pantomime villain here, but never to the point where he's overacting, but he's still a joy to watch with a great plan. Pryce is one of my favourite actors, so I might be a little biased, but he's delightful here, and a close second to Sanchez in being my favourite villain in the franchise. Götz Otto is also really underrated as the henchman Stamper. While I wouldn't call him an all-time great, I love how the screenwriters get to add little touches to his personality, like his fanatic loyalty to the cause, and on that topic that's another thing I love about this film. The little touches here and there, like Gupta's drug and porn stash in his safe, Stamper's personal attachment to the mission, Dr. Kaufman in general. They might seem like small things in the grand scheme of the movie itself, but a little goes a long way in fleshing out a character. Just look at the Greedo scene in A New Hope for a perfect example of this, and how a small change can completely change and even damage a scene. The action in this movie is pretty awesome also, with my highlight being the climax on Carver's stealth boat. Critics saw this as a clone of Die Hard, but if anything I take that as a compliment, given that Die Hard is pretty much considered one of, if not the best action movie of all time. I guess my only complaints about this movie is that Sheryl Crow's title song is honestly pretty crap. K.D. Lang's Surrender was far superior and should have been used instead, and Terry Hatcher's performance as Paris Carver is a little weak. But even then, this is an element I really liked about this movie. Bond finding a former flame and experiencing her reaction to him, as well as adding some more personal animosity between Bond and Elliot. I used to not be overly fond of Henry Gupta either, but honestly the whole cyber-terrorism is so late 90s that I enjoy it. He reminds me of the kind of guy that would browse 4chan in his underwear in his spare time and just have fun. And that's what this movie is, fun, but also surprisingly intelligent for a Bond movie. It's aged wonderfully, more so than any other Bond movie for me, while still retaining that 90s escapist feel, if that makes any sense. It's my favourite James Bond movie and one of my favourite movies of all time, and that ain't likely to change soon. So, what are your thoughts on my list? Do you want to maybe see me do a full-length review and explore my adoration of Tomorrow Never Dies? Do you want to better understand why I'm not so fond of popular films like The Living Daylights and Live and Let Die? Give me your feedback and I'll be sure to get back to you. With that said, I'm Q Branch and I'm signing off.